Okay, let's begin, inshallah. Let's begin by reciting Surah Al-Fatiha. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وآله وصحبه ومن والاه اللهم يا منور يا فتاح نور قلوبنا بنور معرفتك وافتح لنا أبواب حكمتك وانشر علينا خزائن رحمتك إنك على كل شيء قدير اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وإخلاصا وصدقا في الدين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وصلى اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Alhamdulillah. So forgive me for starting late today. There's some people online that were hitting me up saying, what happened? Alhamdulillah. We're praying earlier and then inshallah we'll try and still finish within an hour or so. So if there are any questions from last week, now's the time to ask them. At this point in the course, we've gone through really the bulk of the tools and concepts that we're going to be talking about in this class that formulate what are essential to understand in order for us to understand our tradition as Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So what we're going to be presenting on today, again, is going to be a separate tradition, but nonetheless something that is going to be extremely valuable for us to know and to understand in terms of how we make sense of our own tradition. And as you'll come to see, there are going to be concepts and topics or ideas that are going to integrate into the way that we as Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah will think about this tradition, but from a place that is anchored in revelation. And as we said before, the real difference in between what the mutakallimun, theologians of Sunni Islam were after versus what we saw from the philosophical tradition of Islam was that the theologians recognized that you had to be anchored in revelation, that there were certain things that the mind or the intellect were able to conclude and were able to arrive at. But then there are a whole number of doctrines and ideas that we are incapable of arriving at void of revelation. And so revelation becomes key to understanding what our tradition is, obviously, and how to make sense of reality properly. All right. Now, the philosophical tradition, or the Philosopher, this is going to be the first group that we're going to look at. And then from there, we're going to look at another group in this sort of realm of theology known as the Mu'tazila. And then from there, hopefully that will give us enough of a basis of understanding what we're not doing in order for us to understand what it is that we are doing as Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So insofar as the different tools and concepts that we have been talking about, logic and rhetoric and grammar, or what are known as the instrumental sciences, as well as the basis of the methodology that we use to approach our source texts. Does anyone remember the science? What we called that science? So before that, there's a methodological science that we use to approach the source texts in order to understand what our source texts, the Quran and Sunnah, are telling us. Usul, good. Who said that? Okay, good. Usul fiqh. Okay. that gives us an understanding of what it is that our revelation is telling us, insofar as what it is that we have to believe as Muslims. It also tells us what it is that we have to do, our praxis, okay? The practice that we have as Muslims, how to practice this religion properly. And then lastly, how it is that we're supposed to be as human beings, what it is that we're striving for, and how to animate those truths that we hold, and the way in which we practice this religion, insofar as that being the motivation behind our lives, right? So it gives us our theological judgments, our legal judgments, and our spiritual judgments. Now, here's going to be one iteration of a Islamic intellectual group who take what it is that we've now looked at with their own hermeneutic, or the approach that they're using to understand the source texts, and then coming up with a model or a program by which they are calling sort of an authentic version of Islam. They're the Philosopher. And really, when we're talking about the Philosopher here, it becomes somewhat of a vague term. I've said this before, but philosophy as a general term is different than when we talk about falsafa or philosophy from within the Islamic intellectual tradition. And really within any tradition that you're talking about, you have to really know, well, what type of philosophy are you speaking about? The Peripatetics, i.e. the commentators on Aristotle and the Aristotelian worldview, are a school. You have the Platonic school, and then obviously later on you're going to develop into a variety of other schools as we see them now today, continental school and otherwise. When we look at the Islamic intellectual tradition, what we're really looking at when we talk about falsafa and Islamic philosophy are going to be the ideas of Ibn Sina. Insofar as the way that Ibn Sina takes from a tradition that is at its core Aristotelian, but also somewhat synthesizing many Platonic ideas within that core idea, okay? And so the reason why Ibn Sina is really who we're studying when we're talking about falsafa is because of the giant, the intellectual giant that he was. And we've said this before, but Avicenna becomes a massive influence, not only in the Islamic world, but in the Christian world, as well as in the Jewish world. I mean, there are many Christian theologians in the post-classical period who are going to be looking at Ibn Sina, as well as Ibn Rushd, and taking almost verbatim from what it is that they have put forth, posited, and creating a system for themselves. So I'm talking about people obviously like St. Thomas Aquinas and those who follow, right? You can find within St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, verbatim things that were taken from Ibn Rushd or Averroes, okay? And arguably the quote-unquote Western world, right? Don't really like that, but you know what I'm saying. They go down that sort of route, sort of Ibn Rushd, Averroes route. And it's not going to be the route that the Muslims take. And there's a narrative that unfolds, and we'll hopefully get into all of that when we get there, inshallah. So the Philosopher, what exactly is the philosophical argument that they make? So they begin with existence as a given. They're not going to spend all that much time to try and debate nihilists or people who are skeptics, or like kind of like radical skepticism. You know, if you don't believe I exist, it's going to be really hard to have a debate with you. Okay, and so they didn't really waste too much time there. So existence is a given. Then they said we also know that the things that we observe in the world are constantly changing. And they're changing because of some type of underlying cause. Okay, so if I drop this phone, for example, yeah, mate's like, don't drop it. If I drop this phone, it drops because I let go of it. I let go of it because I made a decision to let go of it, etc. And so there are a series of causes that underlie every effect. So what they say is, okay, well, if you take the series of causes, then that which is caused by them, the effect, is something that is accidental or contingent, okay? For example, the phone didn't have to fall due to its nature. I didn't have to let go of the phone due to my nature, and you know, I didn't have to choose to do that. So you have a series of contingent events, and these are all called effects, and each effect has one or more series of causes. And so what they'll say is when you have a sufficient and necessary set of causes, for a thing, then the effects will necessarily follow. This is actually an extremely important premise for their system, and it's going to be something that you should hold on to. Okay, I'll say it again. When a sufficient and necessary set of causes are available, then the effect will necessarily follow. Okay, we'll come back to it and I'll show you why this is going to be extremely important for them. In other words, the whole grid of existence in their mind of these contingent events are related to each other in kind of an ever-growing complexity, right? Now, the issue here is you can have a huge number of series of contingent events in a grid that are related to each other, and then you ask the question, okay, well, what is it that produced this set of contingent events? One of the answers, and they kind of demarcate them into three viable answers. The first answer that you can give is, number one, there was another set of contingent events outside of the ones that we're looking at, the ones that are produced. And then you would have to ask the same question, and you get the same answer. And then you would ask the question again, and you get the same answer, so on and so forth, ad infinitum, and you would repeat forever, okay? And so the Muslim philosophers would say that this is an actual infinite series. And if it's an infinite series, it can't be traversed in time. And if that's the case, your system or your explanation is not going to work, right? This is what's known as the theory of infinite regress, okay? If I have to wait infinitely in the past for a infinite series of events to take place before I can do what it is that I'm going to do, will I ever do it? I won't do it. So the basis of that becomes the basis by which they are able to eliminate that there could ostensibly be an infinite amount of contingent series into the past. So that's not going to work. So then the second position is, okay, well, you can take the whole set of contingent events and then say that they're self-generated. Say, okay, well, how are they self-generated? So you can say, well, event A produces event B, and then event B produces event C, all the way down until you get to Z. And then you ask, okay, well, hold on a second, what produced event A? And you say, oh, well, event Z produced event A. What have you done there? You've done a circle, right? It's a vicious circle, circular reasoning, or what's known as a self-generative claim, okay? In order to explain for the thing that the cause that produced the effects, you're using the effect to then explain the cause of the cause. Right. What's that? Exactly. So that's not going to work either. So the basic solution that is offered in this conundrum is the following. They say, given that contingency cannot be self-productive, you have to posit something outside of the series of contingent events. And you have to say that it's not contingent, it's necessary. And since modalities, we haven't gone through this yet, but you'll come to see, are one of three. So something is either necessary, impossible, or possible. And since impossible things don't exist necessarily, the only thing that you're left with, if it's not contingent, is necessary, right? Contingent and possible are the same thing, by the way. So that's ultimately what happens, and they arrive at the necessary cause. Does that make sense? Yeah. The proof or just the, which part? There's a lot. Okay, so the solution that they offered, right? Okay, what they do is they say that these contingent series of events have to be produced by something, and it cannot be contingent, nor can it be self-productive. Therefore, the only thing left is necessary existence, i.e., the necessary cause. All right. So that ultimately is what they would say is God, right? Now, again, this is a very specific conception of God, so we have to think about it within the realm of the philosophers here. The next question that they ask is, okay, well, can this God be more than one? Now, the question that they're really trying to ask is a question around what is known in philosophy as simplicity, but we'll get there, inshallah. So they say, all right, we have something necessary outside of the series of contingent events. Could this thing be 2 or 3 or 4, however many? And so they would say, well, no. And the reason is because if you have a necessity that is next to another necessity, you would have to distinguish between the two. If they're completely identical in space and in time and in nature, etc., then there's no way to distinguish between them. So your distinguishing of them becomes entirely arbitrary, i.e., like there's nothing actually separating one from the other. And if you say that one of the contingencies has one perfection and the other one doesn't, well, then that becomes the necessity, which is ultimately productive of the rest. And so you will undeniably have to get back to just being one, right? The necessary cause can only be one cause. Does that make sense? The next question that they ask are, well, okay, can there be parts? Like, can this thing be one but consistent of 2 or 3 parts? And they say, okay, well, this also can't happen for rational reasons as well. Because you can't have accidents or properties producing something that's necessary in itself. Does that make sense? In other words, I have to get up. Sorry to the people at home who can't see this, but I had one thing. Okay. Then I said, okay, let's divide it this way. This one thing, is it now dependent on these 3 parts to make it what it is? Which means that it's not necessary. It becomes dependent on these parts to constitute a whole. See that? Yeah. In other words, if we're saying that this object, this abstract object, right, is the necessary cause, the necessary being, we're asking, well, can it consist of multiple parts, right? The answer that philosophers give is no. And the reason being that if it is composed in this fashion of parts, it becomes dependent, i.e. contingent on those parts to constitute what it is, which wouldn't make it necessary, right? Yeah, sometimes the language that is being used is contingent, possible, dependent. These are all going to be used in some shape or form. So that makes sense, right? Okay, good. The other possibility is that each of the parts of this necessary being are themselves necessary, which means that this whole itself is caused by its parts. And remember, we said that the whole is necessary in itself, so that's also not going to work. So the solution to give, which is the second conclusion, is that the necessary being that we established is one. It cannot have parts, i.e. it's simple. The necessary cause is one, and it is simple, right? Now, in some way, shape, or form, one can say, okay, this is beginning to sound kind of like the Muslim God. Like it seems to be mapping on the scripture in some way, okay? And this becomes the logical, peripatetic basis for the proof that they're giving, okay? For the Muslim philosophers who are adopting this, the idea of a one simple necessary cause is going to be substantiated in this fashion. And they're going to map this conception onto the Quranic statements in order to make sense of what it is that the Quran is actually saying. Does that make sense? Now, from there, they have to give a holistic account, and so it is going to get really deep here. The question that they ask is, all right, what is the relationship of this necessary cause to the world? And so they say, well, we know that this necessary cause, because it's necessary, it can't undergo change. okay? And it can't undergo change because the philosophers say that change, based on our previous premise that we talked about, is going to be produced by a cause. Does everybody remember that? Yeah? Anything that goes from A to not A must have some reason behind it. So if God goes from being, for example, angry to being merciful, then he must have a reason for that change. And in that sense, technically, God is being caused by something other than himself. And if that reason is within God, then God has a part. And we already said that God is simple, he doesn't have parts. So basically, this entity is not only necessary, simple, and one, it's also eternally unchanging, i.e., it's always the same. And the other argument given for the unchanging eternal nature of God is that if God went from being A to not A, then either it went from a state of perfection to a state of non-perfection, or vice versa. So again, we go back to a lot of the concepts that had already been introduced by Aristotle and Plato. The next set of questions then is, okay, if this God is eternal, the problem that Muslim philosophers run into is, if this God is unchanging, then how did he create the world ex nihilo, from nothing? For example, the world didn't exist at one point, and then God decided at time T10 that I'm going to create the world now. Then something at that point has to cause the world to come into existence. In other words, something inevitably caused God to go from not creating to creating. Does everybody see that? So then how does God create the world? The Muslim philosophers are going to say, well, God is the source of everything. He's necessary. He is the eternal, unchanging, and necessary cause of creation, which means effectively that the whole world, from pre-eternity to post-eternity, must exist with God. And this principle stems from the idea that we started with, the premise that I told you all to remember. If you have the necessary and sufficient cause for something, then the effect will necessarily follow. So if you put it into a syllogism, for example, it would be like this. If you have the necessary and sufficient cause for something, then the effect will follow. Premise one. Premise two, God is the necessary and sufficient cause of the entire universe. Therefore, the entire universe must have forever existed with God. Yeah. It's going to have serious implications on that, right? Yeah. And you'll come to see how in a second here. Yeah.
My understanding of the way that we walked through the establishment of why we're saying that's his argument that God is necessary is because we have existence. That was like the given, was that existence is already
given.
And then we're saying that given that we used a given to prove that God is necessary, now we can say that creation is also necessary.
But is it necessary though?
I mean, the idea of the syllogism we just offered is that if you have a necessary instance greater, then you have a necessary universe. You already presumed the consequence. You already said
that's true.
We're assuming creation exists.
Yes.
And therefore we can prove creation exists necessarily because we've asserted it to be the reason for a cause. So it seems circular to me.
Well, it's not circular in the sense that it's providing an understanding of how contingent existence came to be. But it is circular in the sense that the premise itself seems to imply the very same type of conception to God, in that if we're saying that he's necessary and the sufficient cause, and since he's the necessary and sufficient cause, the world, i.e. the effect of the cause, must follow. You're necessitating on this necessary being a particular action. Yeah. And that's obviously going to cause serious problems for them that they're going to have to try and, but ultimately they're going to say, yeah, that's the conception.
So this argument's not going to hold up long term.
It's not going to hold up long term. And I mean, what type of a being are we talking about here? Because it's almost as if we're thinking of God in this very mechanical fashion, right? The necessary cause that is sort of, in this cause and effect relationship with us in the world. Not really a personal God, not really something that has any real practical and viable understanding of meaning in my life, but rather the necessitating force behind everything. And that's obviously going to have implications on their model, particularly when we talk about God's will. Okay, and we'll come to this in a second here. Now, of course, the world still manifests in time, like from, for example, we said like T1 pre-eternity to T10 post-eternity. It's manifesting as if it were an eternal film strip, even though we experience it frame by frame, okay? So what they'll say is that, well, God is causally prior to the world, but ontologically coterminous to the world. How does that work? Ustad Hajar knows how this works, because it's her favorite example. Here we go again. This is my hand, and it has a ring on it. You all see? Okay, I want you to tell me which one moves first, the hand or the ring? Who said hand? Why? Because I... Okay, but well, we're even going farther back. Yeah. The hand affected it, yes. Yes. Exactly. So there's, well, it's ontologically coterminous, but causally prior. Okay. So because there's a priority that is given to the hand over the ring, i.e., it's the hand that moved the ring. Even though both moved at the same time, they would say that the hand moved first, even though both of them happened at the exact same time. That's the type of conception that they're trying to give to God and the world, i.e. God and us and everything in creation. Yeah. Ontology means the state of being. That which exists. All right. So how does the world come about? The Philosopher adopt this type of emanation scheme, given this idea that we've talked about here, and it looks like this. This is the really heavy chart. You don't have to worry if you don't understand like what's going on here. Well, I just noticed that I haven't shared this with the people online. I'm sorry, people online. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, the ring would be contingent on, yeah. But in other words, the explanation that I'm giving is simply the explanation that they give for how creation ultimately manifests or comes into being, right? They say that, well, we come into being out of necessity, in a sense, because we're emanating from the necessary being. So long as there's a necessary cause that exists, i.e. God for them, then the world must exist. Those two things have to go hand in hand. All right. So there's this sort of emanation scheme that they give, right? And we're going to touch on it when we look at the metaphysics. But the idea here is that God exists, therefore, because God exists and he's the necessary cause of everything, then the effect, i.e. that which he caused, must also be in existence, right? And in a sense, if you think about a fountain, this is one of the ways that one of my teachers told me you can think about it. If you think about a fountain, right, it's sort of like spewing out and coming back in and of itself. And this is sort of a non-stop cycle or circular movement that is constantly happening over and over and over again, right? That's the way that you can think about the world in relationship to the necessary cause and necessary being. So God is one for them, equal, necessary, eternal. This God, insofar as a cause of the universe, and because it's simple, can only, as they say, create one being. Therefore, eternally, there is going to be one first eternal prior effect of God, which is the first intellect. In Arabic, they call it al-aql al-awwal, that is emanated eternally by God. And then the first intellect, when it thinks about itself, it has one modulation. And when it thinks about its cause, i.e. God, it has a second orientation. And this model that you're looking at, in a sense, begins with the necessary cause, which is outside of the entirety of the model. And then as we move further and further in, okay, it creates one thing or emanates to one thing, i.e. the first intellect. The first intellect then thinks of itself and thinks of its cause, which then creates a modulation, which brings about the second intellect, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10. You get into the sublunar world, and here we are, right? Human beings seem to be in between, and then all of the other forms of animate life are below that, i.e. the animal kingdom, and then the vegetable kingdom, and then you have inanimate life, right? There's another diagram that I have here that'll make a little bit more sense of this. And we'll talk about it again, inshallah, okay? The physics that they hold, and what's interesting about the peripatetic tradition, the Philosopher, is that they somewhat begin with an understanding of physics, and their metaphysics emerges out of their physics. It's part of the problem that they have, like the serious problem that they have. So physics, as we said, was the first of two theoretical sciences. I'll speak about this in a little bit more detail as we move forward. But physics in the Islamic tradition and the Greek tradition, as we said, is the study of the natural body insofar as it undergoes change. So it provides you a cosmological worldview in which disciplines like astronomy, for example, is then deployed and developed in order to explain their worldview mathematically. So physics aims to tell you what the structure of the universe is. So for example, for the philosopher, this world is limited, it's circular, there's no elliptical motion for various arguments which are going to be philosophically consistent, all right? So the way that we operate, as they say, is going to be fundamental, us like human beings on the earth and everything that is on the earth, right? The way that we operate is fundamentally different than the way that the celestial spheres in the heavens, the skies, operate, right? And the further up you go, even though they're not really talking about direction, so to speak, but the more you transcend, okay, you will begin to see that operation scheme taking on a very different orientation. And for them, that was the reason why the moon hangs in the sky in the way that it does, why they're all perfect spheres in the sky, why they orbit for them in perfect circles, right? That's a divine motion as far as they were concerned, and why we operate in these very linear patterns, okay? We'll go into it a little bit, but this is, again, this worldview for them that had to sort of be consistent and rational in this sense in order for them to make sense of what was happening. So now bodies, that which is in motion, okay, are either animate things or inanimate things. Now, insofar as animate things are concerned, you have three, okay? Plants, animals, and humans. Each one has certain faculties, or quwwa, okay? They thought of them as souls. These faculties are the principles or orientation which allow for the possibility of change. So in plants, as you see, the faculty, the quwwa or nafs, is growth and reproduction. Now, that which is one level above that is animals. Animals contain within them the quwwa or the faculties of plants, i.e. they can grow and they can also reproduce, but they also have movement by will and sensory perception. And then above that are humans, okay? Insofar as humans have a rational soul, i.e. intellect, right? By which we can think about things in the abstract, like, you know, this is a table, we can talk about it as a table, but we can also abstract and talk about tableness, right? That our pets can't do. Even though we had that conversation about dolphins and yeah. And dolphins are really amazing animals. But as far as I know, dolphins aren't talking about tableness to each other and trying to figure it out, right? If anybody knows different. Go learn dolphin, yeah. Come on, Yusuf, what's going on? So the thing to notice is that humans have all of these parts, all right? But humans are also distinguishable in that they're able to be rational. So the jins, the genus, and the differentia, the fasl in Arabic, gives you the species. So the human is thought of as a rational soul. This is also the way that they define things. So the perfect human then, perfect human beings, those who are perfecting themselves, are supposed to align their souls such that rationality sits on the top of everything else that they have in terms of their faculties. So your reason should rule over your other faculties. It should rule over your faculty of growth and reproduction and movement and senses, right? If you're bogged down by that, if you're someone who's bogged down by their irascible soul, right? That sense of anger that causes people to flip out. Like when you're driving on the 91, this guy, cuts you off and then turns into an accident. I saw an accident actually on the way here. I thought for sure they were fighting with each other. I hadn't seen that before. It happens in Cairo all the time. It's kind of like a daily thing. Seeing it here was kind of interesting. But people can lose it, and people do lose it. That's what we mean when we say lose it. What are they losing exactly? This guy lost it. What did he lose? Exactly, he lost the intellect. He lost that rational soul. He lost the ability to allow for the intellect to govern the other faculties that we have, and as a result of which, you end up doing things that you regret later. And the same thing goes then for the concupiscible soul, that side of us that have, animal instincts, passions, desires, right? Satiating the self. And this is both in terms of food, obviously, but also in reproduction, having sex, sexual intercourse. These are things ultimately that human beings were given vis-a-vis these faculties, which again have to be controlled. And insofar as this model is presenting, it's saying, hey, if you're bogged down by that, you're never going to be able to realize your purpose. You're never actually going to be able to see why you were created, who you actually are. Because who you actually are is not these particular qualities of the self, these animalistic or vegetative faculties. Who you actually are, what distinguishes you in relationship to everything else is what? Rationality, the ability to transcend all of that. And rationality, is that something that is physical or non-physical? Non-physical, right? So even the body itself, in a sense, wears us down. And the reason is because that's not who we actually are. And so in a sense, again, I'm not talking here, by the way, about tasawwuf or Islamic spirituality, even though it's very obvious that there are going to be cognates to this. And Imam Ghazali says, well, who took it from who? Who took it from who? He says, well, in reality, all of these things go back to revelation anyways. If there's any truth that is validated and comes with its proofs, we would say that that's something that came from revelation, i.e. that Allah, God, revealed that to a prophet. And so do we see these truths in other places in the world? Yeah. And that's why, again, that prophetic tradition, there's some, discrepancy as to whether or not it's a prophetic tradition or not, but the Prophet ﷺ said, "Al-hikmatu dalatul mu'min," that wisdom is the lost property of the believer. And wheresoever they find it, they have more of a right to it. So the revealed traditions from God, right, all of them are going to have elements within them that, as we say, are reminiscent of the true message. And for us, we know that that is Islam, right? Submission to the will of God. There wasn't a prophet that was sent with this message that went against that concept. And that is the core of what it is that we believe. Submit your will to the will of the Creator. From Adam to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that was the message, right? And remnants of these ideas, these principles, these hikam, these wisdoms are going to be found in all of these different traditions in a way that, we can make sense of. So your reason should rule over these other faculties. Humans, the internal organization of the soul, focusing on abstract things and turning away from the body, brings you towards your nature. And it's in view of that your household is in line, And that's going to impact the greater society and then the macro, et cetera, as we talked about before. Does that make sense? Okay. Again, I don't want us to conflate this for what we learn in Tasawwuf. There are going to be obviously parallels to it, but keep them separate, inshallah. We won't go into the Ptolemaic system, even though it's really interesting. All right, metaphysics. This hopefully should give us a bit more of a breakdown as to what it is that I was talking about before. So, the first diagram is more professional, you can say. This one is for beginners like us, okay? So you have the eternal world, and God's there. And then, as we said before, the sublunar world, which is the lower world, i.e. the world below the sphere of the moon. Okay, so we explained that the Philosopher arrive at the necessity that there is a necessary being that's eternal, simple, one, and everything below is generated through an emanation or faid. Emanation, by the way, is a term that's not really used anymore, but I'm still using it because I think it's just easy to grasp, right? So this emanation from this entity, the cause of other things, and since it's a perfect cause, they say its effects are always with it. But because it's simple and it's only one, so on and so forth, it can only emanate to one thing, i.e. the first intellect. Does everybody see that? So they also call it the simple intellect. And the simple intellect also intellects itself and thinks about its creator or that cause where it came from. And there are now two modalities in this thing. And now when that happens, it generates the next intellect, which is now also a body, because there are two modalities. And this process will keep going until you get to the lowest sphere, which is the sphere of the moon. Okay, the moon for them represents these spheres, which are bodies seen in the sky, and they're eternal because they're emanating from God and have always been with him, even though they're caused by God, as we said before. But these bodies are going in a perfect circular motion with no beginning and no end, because for them, linear motion comes to an end because it actually ends, okay? So these things are not linear. They're going in a circular motion because they're eternal, and there is no beginning and end. So there's no point you can say is a start point or an end point when it comes to circular motion. They've been with God forever. They're causally after or posterior to God, but ontologically in existence with God. Yeah.
Why 10 intellects?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that there was a concept there, but I'm not really sure.
Just more for like projecting assumptions about.
In a sense, yeah.
Kind of superstition of circles where they're just like, there's gotta be 10 everything.
Yeah, and 10 is an interesting number. You can get into this concept as well, where numbers and what numbers mean ultimately. And then for them, numbers have meaning. They're not just quantitative figures. There's quality behind them. Directionality for them is not simply just relational or quantitative either. This is also qualitative. So, and it goes back to the very concept of how they made sense of what a thing is. So there are, quantitative constructs, but those quantitative constructs are never void of qualitative. I mean, in certain ways, you could say that this was part and parcel of all pre-modern traditions. Whether you're talking about Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or otherwise Hinduism, Buddhism, everybody thought like that. It isn't until the modern world where we want to sort of remove quality from quantity, and where at a certain point we think that quantity is quality, which is probably the biggest lie that human beings have ever been told. But anyways, they've been with God forever. They're causally after God, but they exist coterminous with God. And these are also intellects, okay, that are constantly intellecting everything. So they thought of them as intellects. The moon, the Mars, Venus, Saturn, all of them are intellects. And as a matter of fact, they're intellecting on all that one can intellect in terms of the abstractions. So brownness and humanness and blackness and whatever else, okay? Whatever other concepts are out there, the infinite number of them are constantly and actively being intellected by them. And unlike you and me, for example, you might know, for example, the Lorentz theorem for analytic complex functions and how to derive Einstein's theory of special relativity from it, but you're not doing it right now, okay? it's maybe you can say it's a dormant potential in some of us that you have this capacity, unlike these entities, where it's always there, just there necessarily. It's non-inferentially there. So this is the lowest sphere, okay? And humans are generated, the sublunar sphere, right? They're generated by the same process of generation and elimination by the act of the active intellect, which is the first grade above the sublunar world. But keep in mind that these are intermediary agents from God to this world, but intermediary in the sense that they're simple, eternal causes of what comes after them essentially, okay? i.e. in terms of them being caused. In other words, you can think of the whole of the world as this eternal film strip that exists with God from pre-eternity to post-eternity. And the only way that they're distinguished is that they're caused by God. So the way human beings become human is by exercising their rationality. So do you see where the human being lies? A little bit of it is sublunar, in the sublunar realm, and a little bit of us are in the supralunar realm. Why? Because there are aspects of us. That was good. Obey just had his glasses and he was like, like, what's going on here? There's aspects of us that are bodily, physical, okay? Drawn into what makes the world. And then there's an aspect of us that is immaterial. And it's that we're being told is what distinguishes us from everything else. That is what makes us us. That is why you are a human being and not something else. Right? So insofar as you're able to realize that potential, you're fully living, right? So you transcend the physical to contemplate on the essences or the universals of things, as they say, right? The aql, the intellect, is concerned with essences. So as long as human beings are bogged down in this world, they're not being fully human. They're not realizing their nature. So one of the explanations that's given about this process of intellection, they say that human beings go through the lowest grade of analyzing particulars to higher grades until they abstract more and more the knowledge that they have. And this process actually, for the philosophers, begins in the brains with the eyes. For example, the way it goes, their theory of the brain in psychology, I look at this table and it comes to my eyes, okay? From the eyes, it's transferred to something called hiss al-mushtarak in Arabic, the shared space in the brain where different images come. And this is the space in your brain where it's as close as it can be to the physical object. From there, it's transferred to the next layer, and then that layer is where the memory of that thing is preserved. Now, you can take the memory of that thing that's preserved and mix it with the memory of another thing. So now I have a memory of, let's say, a wing and that I saw, and then I have a memory of a horse that I saw, and I can think of those two things in relationship to one another, like a winged horse. I.e., it's more abstract, it's getting further away from this physical reality. Now I can take this memory of this winged horse. By the way, this is part and parcel of why we love fantasy, the genre itself, right? I mean, why else do we make those movies? Yeah, Hollywood is very in touch with this concept. I mean, there are psychological realities to these things. Like we can tell, we're talking about it very abstract and very theoretical, but from a practical perspective, I mean, there's a reason why Avatar is like the highest selling gross movie in all the planet, right? They're about to come out with Avatar 2. It's going to go crazy. But what exactly draws us to that? Like, why are we so infatuated with that? Lord of the Rings, or people that watch.
It just takes you out of this one and you're like into like a fantasy world.
Yeah, but for the philosophers, they would say that the fact that it takes you out of this is actually indicative of who you are. Like there's a reason why you like that. You could not like that. I mean, there are some people who don't. They're not really fans of it. It took me a while to get into Star Wars, let's say. I know, I'm sorry. But I just didn't get it really. But when you do, it becomes something that is really addictive. Yeah.
So if I understand clearly, because the human nature is not physical, anything that exercises a being to spend time outside of the physical entity, i.e. fantasizing, let's say,
Right.
that in a sense makes you more connected to your actual nature.
Yes.
And then the interesting point I mentioned to you earlier that I design video games, right? There's certain things that people find easier time fantasizing about. So somebody might find it where
Right.
something like Lord of the Rings or Avatar for me is too far from the fantasy that I want to fantasize about. Therefore, I will not immerse myself in it. But something like if somebody's into sports and go fantasy football all day, they
Right.
fantasize about what team.
Yeah, that's another one. Yeah, there you go.
So the act of fantasy is the same.
Yeah. And, in terms of the philosophers, they would say that you can use this as kind of like an exercise in order to begin to think about the right types of things, right? Because that faculty within you, if you're using it to try to correspond to these kinds of things, you're missing the mark, right? Like that's there in order for you to train that faculty within yourself in order to arrive at the ultimate truth of everything, right? And there's, for them, I mean, that unveiling, that reality when you come into it is what we're all looking for by design. You're doing it even if you don't know you're doing it, right? And this is where these, movies and sports and, as you're saying, come into play. Again, this is kind of taking their perspective and putting it into some sort of practical understanding. Yeah.
So this is the same thing you do when we're trying to think about God.
Well, in a sense, what you're doing when you're thinking about God is you're using that capacity within yourself to arrive at ultimate reality, right? And so that it's that ability that you have ultimately to contemplate that reality, to arrive at knowing that reality that you've arrived, as they say, right? Like that's what it's all about. Yeah.
I would say, you think it's kind of like art in general? I feel like because it's a form of art, ultimately like art kind of takes us out of ourselves into something that's like we're more connected.
That's true. It's just, what is it taking you into something that is feeding the appetitive soul, or is it taking you into a place that's feeding you from the rational side of who you are? Using their terminology,
Yeah.
right? That's what you have to think about. Now, so we said this process begins with the brain into the eyes. Okay, I can take this memory now of this abstraction, this winged horse, okay, and preserve it in the next part of the brain. And the last part of the brain is where the closest thing to intellection happens. It's not intellection, but it's called the estimative faculty, okay? It's in the lowest or most back part of your brain as far as they're concerned. That's where you take something sensory and you take something and you take a meaning from it that's not sensory. So for example, I can look at a piece of cheesecake, sensory. I'm into cheesecake. And who's not, right? Yeah. And it gives you a connotation of something being tasty, right? Now, being tasty is not a physical thing. Like, taste is a physical thing, but being tasty, what is that exactly? The classical example that they give is a lamb seeing a wolf, okay? So like sensing fear from the physical observation of something is where you have gone now to the last point of abstraction, where you still have maintained some connection with the physical thing, but what you've drawn from it is something very abstract. Somehow, through the course of this abstraction, the next stage is not related to the human body at all whatsoever. That's all your brain can do according to these philosophers. And the next stage, through this process of abstraction, at certain moments, they say, you connect with this active intellect that's only thinking about universal abstract things. Right up here, okay? The first grade above the sublunar world. You connect to that. And in connecting to that, in other words, you're training yourself through the process of abstraction and contemplation and struggling, discursive knowledge, etc., to the point that sometimes you hit upon the true definitions and true meanings of things. And that's the highest grade of abstraction that you can have, understanding the essence of something, like to go beyond the physical things. So there's a dual process, the process of me trying and going through these processes of abstraction and working and training, etc., so that at a certain moment, I have a connection with this active intellect and I understand reality as it is. So this is why humans, again, are in this middle space. They're constantly connecting with the intellect, but they also have a body that connects them to this lower world. And so that's the struggle. And this whole process of human endeavor is supposed to lead you up to be rational, to connect with the active intellect. Like you rise up through certain stations ultimately to be absorbed in the active intellect. Does that make sense? That is ultimately how you arrive at the truth of everything for the philosophers. Okay. How do the Islamic philosophers make sense of prophets? Since we talked about, since the section on divinity is kind of closed, what about prophets? So prophetology is also connected to this as well. And a prophet for the Philosopher is someone who is the most astute and refined and sophisticated philosopher. So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for them, wasn't someone who needed to go through this discursive process the way that you and I do. Like, for example, again, if I give you a math problem in calculus, it's very, very difficult. You might have a proof for 4 pages because you're going through this discursive process and so on, etc. But if you gave this calculus problem to a prophet who's a true philosopher, so he has this connection to the active intellect, he just knows it. He knows the 4 pages of proofs and the conclusion in no time, actually in unified time, as they would say. So he'll know all of reality all of the time, as opposed to us who are constantly striving. Sometimes we make the connection and it unveils reality to us. But prophets are highly advanced philosophers. Now, they also have this imaginative faculty, okay, we won't get into it, which is a highly developed faculty where they actually see physical things. So the philosopher will say that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ actually saw the angel Gabriel, yes. But it's because his faculty of imagination was so highly developed that he could actually see these ideas in physical form. And so for them, the angel Gabriel is what? Is the active intellect. Now, the faces that you're making are good. Those are good signs. Right? It's because we're Sunnis, alhamdulillah. But this becomes the way that they read into the tradition concepts that they have. Hajar, you had a question?
That sounds very, but I think people describe it as hallucination.
Interesting. Well, for them, yeah, it's not a hallucination because it's an unveiling of reality that allows you to know. It allows you to know non-inferentially, in a sense, in the same way that you know that I'm in front of you right now, except that you see this physical reality for what it actually is. Now, again, I'm not denying that these meanings and these unveilings may in fact have been true. What I'm going to deny, though, is the method that they're using. Okay? Their interpretation of what is actually happening and how that relates to scripture. All right? Yeah. Good question. Did the Falasifa believe in miracles? Why?
Because like for the example of angels, like I'm thinking of any right where into as an angel who's able to be spatially located. So he's still an angel, but able to be spatially located. So,
Right.
yes, yes.
Yeah. So that's true. There's also something that I've talked about before in relationship to the way that they understand reality. So the classical example that we give is fire burning, right? So for the Philosopher, under this model, does fire burn, is that proposition, fire burning, okay? Is that a possible relationship that fire has with burning? Or is that a necessary one? Why is it possible? So again, we're not talking about what we're, so you all are trained, alhamdulillah. What do the philosophers say? Necessarily has to burn. Why? Good. Exactly. Good. If it's being necessarily caused by the necessary being, okay, then the effects themselves are necessary, i.e. it's necessitated in that fashion. And so while we can say we're contingent insofar as, and this is what, Avicenna will come up with this really neat design. He'll say that we're possible in ourselves, necessary from another, whereas God is necessary of himself. In other words, these relationships that we see, that we recognize in the world, okay, that we know are possible, and the relationships that they have with one another are also possible. For the philosopher, they'll say, no, they're necessary. Otherwise, we won't be able to know what they are given the model that we've presented. Remember the four causes and the Aristotelian conception of the. And so for them, it becomes an extremely important concept for us to legitimate that when I say fire burns, I'm not saying that it has a possibility or a potentiality to meet that relationship. No, it has to do that. Now, here's the contention and why it goes back to the concept of miracles. In the Quran, we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to the fire at the time that Ibrahim alayhi salam was thrown into the fire, Kuni bardan wa salaman ala Ibrahim. Be peaceful and cool on Abraham. And we know that Abraham fell into the fire, peace and blessings be upon him, and he didn't burn. Now, if you're one of the philosophers and you believe that fire necessarily burns, what do you do with that verse? You have an issue with it. And that's exactly what they did, is that they had an issue with it. And they said, well, you can't read that literally. What that verse is actually saying is that, no, God created an inhibiting cause around the fire. That's what Abraham fell into. And so ostensibly, what have you done? You've removed miracles. There are no miracles for the philosopher. That's what Ibn Rushd did. It's what Ibn Sina did. For them, there were no miracles. Now, let's finish real quickly because I know that we're at time. So ultimately, that's prophets. I mean, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, for them, is just a philosopher of the highest grade. What about eschatology? Okay. They said, look, when your body passes away, when you die, and what survives is this abstract rational soul, nafs al-natiqa. And it's this soul that's going to go on the last day and meet the Lord and be in paradise or hell. Okay, but the question is, well, how is there suffering and how is it being rewarded? If it's not physical, then what is the meaning of these things? And at that point, they basically say, well, the suffering is akin to the person who's suffering while he's in this world, who was not training him or herself to transcend this world. So someone who was not thinking about the abstract notions, but rather getting bogged down by their vegetative and animal soul. Okay, and so when they get there, okay, they have a memory, and that memory becomes now attached to the lower world. And since it's attached to the lower world, they're unable to enjoy their proximity to the divine. So it's this intellectual connection with God at that moment. The reward is that you know all of abstract things, you know manness and humanness and animalness, etc., and the reality of everything forever and all time. In other words, you become subsumed back to the source of all emanation. So that's the understanding of paradise and hell, right? This is obviously problematic for the mutakallimun of Ahl Sunnah, for our theologians, for our tradition. who are going to have serious issues with this interpretation of scripture, right? But these are a few of the doctrines of the Philosopher and how they made sense of this concept. Now, the one thing I'll say is this. There are parallels in certain degrees. And insofar as the concept of unveiling reality as it is, okay? This venture was not going to be a venture that our tradition thought of as theological per se. There is a theological element there in the sense that you have to have a proper worldview that gives you an understanding of what your doctrines are and why those doctrines are true. But an unveiling of reality doesn't happen in that way. Because you can know that something is true and not do it. You can know that something's really, really bad for you and do it. So it's not really that. It's not that capacity within you that gives you these unveilings. What does give you those unveilings? It's your spiritual cultivation. It's something within you that transcends the ability that you have to intellect or sort of come to these analytic truths, even though we still grant that truth in this analytic fashion is extremely important. You know, one of the most attractive things for many people about the religion of Islam is its ability to be so rational, right? There's no proposition in this religion that is irrational. There may be propositions or beliefs or doctrines that are supra-rational, that go beyond the capacity of the mind. But you will never be asked to hold on to a doctrine that is irrational. And that's the reason why the Islamic intellectual tradition, you know, was thrived as an intellectual tradition for thousands of years. But they also recognize that the true unveiling of reality and the true connection, that experiential knowledge that human beings are all thirsty for, that really solidifies what it is that we believe, all of us as human beings, that comes through spiritual cultivation. That comes through eradicating within yourself vices and inculcating within yourself virtue. And doing it in a way that allows for you to go beyond the self. When you talk about transcending the self, that's what transcending the self is about. You know, transcending the self is in your ability to see everything around you as a reflection of the divine, in that you lose yourself in that. Those are the first steps of understanding Islamic spirituality properly, and the way in which it's going to reflect on the model that was presented here. Inshallah, we'll end there. By the way, there's a lot of benefit. I just want to say this because it's hot and we're all like, you know, we're going through all this stuff, and it's taking a lot out of us to try to like think about these concepts and to do it in a room like this. But just know, with the right intention, what you're doing is a type of jihad, fi sabilillah. It's a type of divine struggle that you're giving to God, to try to understand your religion properly, to try and really come into these truths. And, you know, it's uncomfortable, but you gain a lot in it being uncomfortable. Ask anyone who studied, go ask Shaykh Shaman and Shaykh Muslima the way in which they studied overseas. You know, even my own, I mean, I come into this room, it's this hot. And what did I say when I first walked in? I was like, you know, this is the real deal. Like, you're getting the real experience here, right? So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you. May He reward all of you for the struggle. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us a good understanding of this religion, to allow us to be people who connect to Him in the best of ways. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be people of kindness, to be people of mercy, to be people of love, to be people of service. بإذن الله تعالى اللهم لك الحمد حتى ترضى ولك الحمد إذا رضيت ولك الحمد بعد الرضا ولك الحمد كالذي نقول خير مما نقول ولك الحمد كالذي تقول ولك الحمد على كل حال اللهم إنا نسألك الهدى والتقى والعفاف والغنى اللهم استرنا بسترك الجميل اللهم يا الله يا الله يا الله بجاه أسماء الله وصفات الله ورسل الله وأنبياء الله والصالحين من عباد الله اللهم اقضي حوائجنا ظاهرا وباطنا نصر من الله وفتح قريب وبشر المؤمنين. Ya Allah, we ask you, all of us have come into this room with needs and with things that we're searching for. We ask you, Ya Allah, to give us that which we're searching for. We ask you to alleviate our needs. We ask you to facilitate for us that which we are seeking, Ya Rabbi Ya Kareem. We ask you, Ya Allah, to bring us closer to you. We ask you, Allah, to allow us to submit ourselves to you. We ask you, Allah, to bless us with the light that you have blessed those who have been guided through this religion, through your way. And we ask you, Allah, to allow our way to be ultimately the way of the prophets and the messengers and the saints. Ya Rabbi ya Kareem, sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Barakallahu feekum. We'll end here, inshallah. Begin again next week. We have one more group to talk about. It's not going to take this long. And then inshallah, we'll actually get into our tradition. Inshallah. We'll see, yeah. Alhamdulillah rabbil alameen.